In May of 2023, DHS released a National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin which warned of emerging threats regarding the 2024 election and domestic extremist violence. How would the implementation of the FBS security recommendations actually help address and hopefully prevent these threats? If you could be more specific for the committee, that would be wonderful.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters. The security countermeasures that we recommend are based on the ISC standards, obviously, with the goal of obtaining the necessary level of protection to ensure that the employees are safe in their workplace. We also conduct a threat assessment of that facility to determine the local threats, national threats, international threats, and any threats that may be associated with a specific agency that's located within that facility. And we also work with the agencies on plans to enhance that protection at that facility based on the NTAS levels. All this is used to determine the countermeasures necessary to ensure protection of the employees and the facility. So the goal of reaching that necessary level of protection, which is basically the minimum security standards to protect the facility, is necessary whether it's day-to-day operations or during an NTAS elevation.
Director Klein, next question is, in your written testimony, you mentioned the, quote, significant role that the Federal Protective Service plays in countering threats posed by unmanned aircraft systems. However, FBS authority to counter these unmanned aircraft systems is actually going to expire this coming February. Would you please explain why it's so important that we extend this authority and what you believe the consequences could be if we do not extend this critical authority?
Thank you very much, sir, and we really appreciate the work of the committee members, yourself included, for pursuing the extension of that counter-UAS authority. It's critical for us to ensure the protection of federal facilities. Today, we have a counter-UAS mitigation operation in place at the headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security. We also have a mobile system we use that we deploy to federal facilities during high-risk events, like high-risk trials that may be going on around the country. We work with the FAA to implement the temporary flight restriction and then set up the counter-UAS program at that facility. For us, without that ability, we have detected about 900 drones in and around federal facilities since 2019. That's a good number. Most of those are not targeted at federal facilities. The ones that we have mitigated at St. E's, normally it's on Christmas afternoon when someone got a new drone for Christmas and they don't realize that they're flying into a temporary restricted airspace. But this is an emerging threat across the country. We see what's going on in other parts of the world with drones, and we think it's critical that authority be continued and extended to the agencies that are mentioned in the draft legislation, but also to continue our operation at the critical federal facilities that we protect.
Thank you, Mr. Maroney. In your May 2023 report, GAO found that almost 70% of the countermeasures recommended by the Federal Protective Service to help secure buildings were not implemented by agencies. So I think this committee needs to hear what are the primary reasons why agencies, in your estimation, are rejecting, ignoring, or failing to implement these recommended countermeasures?
So a number of reasons. On the side of rejecting, not approving. Sorry about that. A number of reasons. On the side of not approving recommendations, cost considerations were cited by many officials, budgetary considerations. So many of these facilities are multi-tenant agency facilities, so each of those agencies needs to provide funding to implement some of these countermeasures that can add some level of difficulty. Sometimes there's feasibility concerns. The recommendations are based on the ISC standards, but some facilities, based on their age or other space limitations, it may not be possible to implement there. On the other side, and even more concerning, the 55% of recommendations where there was no response from the committees. And the reasons cited there range from the time frame. Agencies have 45 days from receiving the recommendations to make a decision. Some agencies said that was too tight of a time frame for more complex countermeasures. Also, reluctance sometimes to accept risk of not implementing recommendations they choose not to implement. They don't want to formally note that. And then at times, communication issues among the committees. This is a collateral duty for the officials on these committees, and sometimes they do not have as much expertise, and so responding to the recommendations can not be as high of a priority as it should be.
Clearly, it is a priority, so we're going to have to work to make that so. So I've got a question for both you, Mr. Maroney, and to you, Mr. Klein, is that I have been working on legislation that would require agencies to respond to the Federal Protective Service security recommendations within 90 days. So I want both of your opinion. Would such a requirement improve responsiveness and building security in your estimation? We'll start with you, Mr. Maroney first, and then Mr. Klein.
Yes, that's in line with our recommendations from earlier this year of the importance of increased oversight on these recommendations, particularly the ones where they're not responded to. The ISC standards allow for agencies to accept risk and not implement recommendations, but they at least should be responding and formally accepting risk if they're not going to do so. So, yes.
That's a very strong yes. Mr. Klein.
Yes, sir, and I'd agree with a very strong yes. The ISC requirement is the 45 days. We have heard from agencies, I need more time, this is very complex, I got to coordinate with the other agencies located in a multi-tenant facility. 90-day requirement coming through legislation would definitely strengthen the agency's need to reply to those recommendations.
Great. In your oversight of agency compliance with security standards, you rely on agencies to fill out questionnaires. However, your current questionnaires do not ask for information on the risk that agencies take if they fail to respond or choose not to follow Federal Protective Service recommendations. Why does ISC not account for these risks?
Thank you, sir. Currently, in the benchmark questionnaires that we have, at the agency level, we qualify that as risk acceptance versus describing it as implementation of a countermeasure. At the facility level, we actually do have that question. But what we've been seeing in the compliance feedback that we've been getting, we've been doing compliance now for 2 years, is that at the agency level, only about 50% of them actually have the plans, policies, and protocols in place that then cascade down to the facility level. So therefore, I think the tenants at the local level are just having that difficulty doing what is required with respect to the ISC due to lack of understanding and lack of training. Because of that, over the last year, we've doubled down on training Federal Security Committee members. We have virtual online training. We have in-person training, and also virtual instructor-led training to try to get the FSC members trained up to par. But I think more importantly, once we get the senior official designated for the agencies, we'll be able to increase the compliance aspects. And not only the documentation of unimplemented countermeasures, but also ensuring that the plans, policy, and protocols are in place in each of the agencies and departments.
Well, given you're not getting this information, that seems problematic. I guess my follow-up question to you, do you think you have enough data to actually understand the risk that agencies are facing right now, or do you need more data to really do the type of assessment necessary to secure these facilities?
That's exactly why we totally embrace the GAO recommendations and are moving forward with changing the questionnaire and the benchmarks in 2024 during the compliance run.
So you don't have the data you need right now?
Not the full understanding of what exact countermeasures are being implemented, whether it's being documented, and whether that is supported by the department and agency at that level.
So clearly a major problem.
Yes, sir.
That was yes.
Yes.
Right. Director Klein, given the heightened threat environment and the need to ensure security of federal buildings and workers and the public that shows up at those facilities every day, does the Federal Protective Service, in your estimation, have enough uniformed officers to actually secure this portfolio?
Thank you, sir. That's a great question. So we are short-staffed right now. but we're still getting our mission done. We're using overtime dollars right now because we have officers staying later to protect our facilities, and it remains a challenge for us. We're observing some impact on our employee morale. I'm focused on ensuring that we don't have a burnout factor within our law enforcement workforce. And I've mentioned previously, my number one priority is to fill those vacancies. I did travel down to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center earlier this year, met with the director and asked for additional seats or classes for the basic police academy at Bletzy. We now have 8 classes through this year. By the end of this year, we should fill at least 75% of our vacant law enforcement positions. And then I don't want to tell you that I need more people right now because I need to fill the vacant positions I have and then evaluate how we're doing with filling all the vacancies, having all our fully staffed on board, and then make decisions on do we need more. Now that we know we've got everyone on board, we can evaluate and determine if we need more people.
So the vacancies that are there, you said you're increasing your training academies. Are you having difficulty recruiting folks to the service, or is there a long line of folks wanting to raise their hand and serve?
We've had a little bit of both, Mr. Chairman. So we are competing for the same person that every other law enforcement agency is competing, city, county, state, and federal. We're all competing for that young, vibrant person to become part of our agency. Right now, it is a challenge to fill the seats. We are working kind of backwards, so we're filling the first classes first, and then we're working towards the other classes. We're reaching out to our candidates who have applied for our positions to check on, are you available to go to school on this date or this date or this date? A number of folks that we've recruited want to go to specific locations. And we may be filled, or we may not have vacancies in those locations, so we're offering them locations nearby. But they may want to go to one point because that's where they're from, that's where their family is. Whatever the reason is, they're stuck on, that's where I want to go. So we're going down that list of our people that we have in the pipeline, calling them, asking them about the due location. Here's what we have available nearby. Do you want that? And it's an all-out effort within all of our managers at FPS to fill these classes and to hire these people. I did mention the retention incentive earlier, sir, during my oral statement. You know, we have officers that are leaving to go to other agencies, and they may have a better benefit than we do, or they're retiring or resigning for one reason or another. I worked with my boss and asked for the ability to provide a retention incentive to keep who we have on board, to keep them here until we can get these other new employees through all the training requirements and on board. We have a lot coming up in the next 14 months. Affecting federal facility security, including some trials that are coming up, the RNC and DNC, the election, and then ultimately the inauguration, that we need to make sure we have plenty of people available to respond and secure these facilities. That's why we went with this retention incentive. It does take effect next pay period for our current officers and agents. It's for our GS-12s and below, the people that we are trying to retain. And we think that's going to help us keep what we have on board while we fill the other classes and hire those other people.
That retention's for everybody.
Retention is for all of our law enforcement officers, GS-12 and below.
Yeah.
Not for me.
Right. So yeah. So the question is the folks who are coming out new, because of all the challenges that you mentioned, highly competitive environment for law enforcement, a lot of offers are out there for folks. What is your retention rate for the newly graduated, the newly incoming folks? How many are there a year after training?
A year after training, 80%.
2 years.
We do lose some during the training. You know, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center has very high standards on test scores and fitness scores, and we do lose some people during that part of the.
How much do you lose through training?
5%.
And
It's
then-
not a huge number.
Yeah.
But then, so we're looking at age groups. Over the last 5 years, we've been really focused on hiring veterans, using that veterans hiring authority to quickly bring them on board, deserving of an opportunity to join the federal government, especially when they've served overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan. And we've been really hiring a lot of those folks, but they're around 40 years old. They're a little older than the people that we're looking to recruit now, because we need a new focus on those young and vibrant, recent college graduates that have a different perspective on how to do things than old people like me. So we're focused on hiring those new folks now. Our retention rate is 14%. We lose about 14% of our LEOs every year. But we think that by offering this retention incentive for a couple of years while we fill these classes will allow us to keep them on board. And some do go to other agencies that have a better benefit than they have within FPS.
So given your challenges to be fully staffed, in the event that FPS officers can't respond to a developing incident, or there's simply not enough officers available, how do you cooperate with state and local law enforcement to make sure that you're adequately responding? If you could kind of walk us through as to your backup plan when bad things happen, you need people, where do you get them?
Absolutely, sir. We have great relationships with our city, county, and state and federal law enforcement partners throughout the country. Obviously, we don't have FPS officers in every city across the nation. We primarily staff our officers in those major metropolitan areas where there's a large federal community in that area. So there's many instances every day where a local law enforcement officer will respond to an incident at a federal facility because there's no FPS officer nearby. The FPS officer will respond, but he may be there in an hour, he may be there in 15 minutes, depending on how far he's commuting to that specific location. So city, county, state, and federal law enforcement office agents and officers are closely tied to our mission. Our authority is the federal facility and the people in the facility. That sidewalk, that street, that city belongs to another law enforcement agency, and we have great partnerships with them to ensure our facilities are protected. And that happens every day, that coordination effort. We do work with our local law enforcement agencies to retain some level of authority to issue citations based on the city law enforcement. As an example, there's no federal crime for parking in a handicap zone, but we have handicap parking spaces in every facility across the country. So we leverage the local jurisdiction's violation notice to cite someone for a local crime instead of where there may not be a federal crime. And the local jurisdictions provide us that authority.
Very good. Mr. Maroney, federal real property management has been on the GAO's high-risk list now, I think, for over 20 years. Could you explain why it remains on that list, and what do we need to be focusing on? We got to get it off that list.
It's been on that list for 20 years because, one, there continue to be incidents which make it a high-risk area, but two, based on our ongoing work, we've continued to identify areas of need for improvement. Now, to the agency's credits, to ISC and FPS's credit, they have constructively addressed many of these recommendations. But to our next update is in 2025, and so we will be looking at how the agencies address the remaining open recommendations, including the recommendations that I've discussed today on facility security assessments. We'll also have an ongoing review looking at FPS's addressing of challenges, physical security challenges at buildings. So we'll be completing that in the fall, and we'll use that to consider where things stand for 2025. So bottom line, we need to see further progress on our open recommendations, and we'll consider that as whether to take this off the high-risk list.
Great, thank you. Mr. Brewer, critical infrastructure like the United States electrical grid is certainly very vulnerable to physical as well as cyber trespass that can disrupt transformers, electric transmission lines. My question for you is, can you explain how CISA is mitigating these threats and what measures it is encouraging federal agencies in particular to adopt to help secure this critical infrastructure in our country?
Yes, sir. Matter of fact, a very timely question now that we're coming to the end of Critical Infrastructure Protection and Resilience Month. We work with all sectors to ensure that they can mitigate the threats they face. Just recently, we published a toolkit in collaboration with HHS for public health. With respect to substation security, we've been working with the Department of Energy for well over 10 years. All across the nation, we have protective security advisors who will support the local electricity providers to do security assessments at their substations. We're all familiar with what occurred at Metcalf back in 2013, and we totally support the critical infrastructure protection regulation that NERC then followed that event. And as we've seen recently, they've with respect to the threats, Metcalf was focused on the generation of electricity. We're now seeing at distribution sites, and we're seeing a increase with respect to ballistic type attacks. So we're working with electricity providers with their risk management process to see how best to mitigate the threats at those substations. There's many options, and every substation is very unique. So and we'll continue to support them. As mentioned, the public health, we're supporting water, wastewater with respect to their cybersecurity requirements. And as you recall, back in March, we released the cybersecurity performance goals, which are focused on that information technology and operational technology, which with respect to the cyber threat speaks to many of the lifeline subsector cyber risk that they face.
Great, thank you. Director Klein, back to some personnel issues. We've talked about the vacancies and training, but I know in order to supplement folks, you have hired a number of contract guards to help protect the facilities. So I want to question is, when you hire these contract folks, how do you conduct oversight to ensure that they've received the necessary training to protect these federal facilities that require usually additional training than you may get from a contract guard?
Right. So the Protective Security Officer Program has been around I joined FPS 21 years ago, and it was in place before I joined. So these are the people that you see at our federal facilities. They are conducting screening operations, X-ray magnetometer. They're conducting roving patrol, security operations around the federal facilities. They're staffing facility command centers to review video surveillance system monitors. And they are basically the first line of defense at those federal buildings that you're going to enter, those highest risk federal facilities. They have the PSOs at the entrances doing that screening operation. They also ensure that the federal employees that are coming in, that they have the required access media or ID cards to get into the facility. We spend a lot of time during compliance assessments and inspections of the PSOs every year. We do this through post-inspections where our inspectors will visit their assigned facilities and do inspections of the protective security officers that are assigned to that building. We also have a database where all of their training records are maintained, and we can see that on a daily basis. It also alerts us if any of those training requirements come out of date. We don't allow that protective security officer to stand post until their training requirements are fulfilled. Have 13 different training requirements that they have every year that they have to meet. And then also their suitability background investigations is almost identical to what most federal law enforcement officers are. We spend a lot of time overseeing these contracts. We do a lot of these contracts throughout the country. We're visiting with them every day. So right now at this minute, there's about 6,250 protective security officers on duty across the country and our territories. We know how critical of a role they play in the defense of our protective facilities, and we spend a lot of time ensuring that their training records are maintained properly, that they are meeting all the requirements, and that they are complying with the requirements of the post orders at their specific facility.